Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandham at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
It's that time again for a football by numbers special and jersey number 89. The greatest NFL players that wore that jersey is coming up with Dan and Andrew Newman of the Hello Old Sports podcast. We're going to talk about some great tight ends, a few defensive linemen, and much more coming up in a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with pigskindispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com, and welcome once again to the Pig Pen, our football by numbers. And it's hard to believe, but we are all the way up to jersey number 89. We started at zeros. We've been counting them up, and we have some great guests. One of our fan favorites here, we have Dan and Andrew Newman of Hello Old Sports podcast on Sports History Network joining us to help us with jersey number 89s. Dan and Andrew, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I do have to ask, you said we have one of our fan favorites here today. Which one of our fan favorite?
Well, you're one of our fan favorite guests as a group, you know.
Oh, okay. Good.
I wasn't singling you out.
I appreciate you being diplomatic for Dan.
Yeah. The podcast, one of our fan favorites here.
Yes. Now,
Thanks for having us on.
Glad to be here again, Darren. I think I did number 4, just me, and then Andrew and I since then have done 51 and 58 and 64 and something else, and maybe in the 70s or something. So this is good. I think this is the last one we're doing. So it's been a lot of fun. I think we did the very first one back in like February. So this has been great. Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you for joining us. It's a lot better than just hearing me talk. This is great for the listeners too. And so we appreciate getting your insight and your wisdom of the football knowledge of these great players throughout football history. And I guess we'll start off where we normally do. We'll talk about your podcast here at the end, if you don't mind. But let's start off with who the Pro Football Hall of Fame says wore number 89. And the first one they say is Willie Davis. And I could not find anywhere. And I think when we talked before we started recording here, none of us could find Willie Davis in a jersey number 89 in the NFL. So we probably will dismiss him from our discussion, even though he was a great player, just not a great 89. But the other ones on there are 4 great players, Mike Ditka, Dave Robinson, Gino Marchetti, and John Mackey. Some great Hall of Famers wearing that 89.
Yeah, no, those are 4 really great Hall of Famers. Robinson, a member of those great 60s Packers teams. Mackey and Ditka, who I think might have been the first two Hall of Famers, or I'm sorry, the first 2 tight ends inducted into the Hall of Fame, the sort of the pioneers at that position in the 60s. And then Marchetti, I guess it's pronounced, was the defensive leader of those great Baltimore Colts teams of the 50s and early 60s. He kind of was to the defense on those teams what Unitas was to the offense. So yeah, those are 4 really strong Hall of Fame players.
Yeah, Mackey only number 89 for his last year with San Diego in 72. So, I know we've done this song and dance before. I didn't have him on my list just because, not that he's not a great player, but I just don't have him because it was, he did not wear the number in his glory years with the Colts, and in fact only wore it for 13 games, during which time he caught 11 passes. So I'm not sure if everybody else put him on there and overlooked that, but up front, I did not include him in my list for those reasons.
Yeah, I didn't have Mackey on there either for similar reasons, just one season. And there are so many great players that are not in the Hall of Fame, plus our Hall of Famers, that it's pretty easy to come up with a list of 10 without Mr. Mackey on there for one season.
Yeah, I tend to take that approach too, as those who've listened to us on this before have heard. So yeah, Mackey was not in my top 10 either, but a great player nonetheless.
All right. Well, where do we want to start our discussion at? Do you want to start with our Hall of Famers?
I think that's good. Yeah.
I had Marchetti at number 1, or Marchetti. I thought it was Marchetti, but I wasn't sure. So I had him at number 1. I understand there's a couple other guys who may have something to say about that, but I look at him as he was a 9-time first team All-Pro for 9 straight years from 56 to 64. Has his number retired for the Colts, which I always put a premium on when it comes to these things. He's also in the Ravens Ring of Honor, despite obviously having never played for the Ravens, but because he's a Baltimore legend, they do the right thing and honor him. So and he also had a big play in what they call the greatest game ever played in 1958. He tackled Frank Gifford, then got hurt and very famously would not leave the sideline, wanted to watch the rest of the game from the sideline. And in 1972 was called the greatest pass rusher ever. Now, obviously, a lot of football has been played since then, but all of those were reasons I went with him as number 1.
Unanimously selected to the NFL 100th anniversary team 2 years ago. Forrest Gregg said that Marchetti was the best player that he ever played again. And not that this should make a difference, but it's also worth noting that before he came to the NFL, he also fought at the Battle of the Bulge. So a guy who had a really neat life, a lot of neat experiences. Also opened, I'm sorry?
I don't know if the Battle of the Bulge was a neat experience.
An interesting experience. Obviously a very historically important experience is probably a better way to put it. And one of these guys, like a lot of these Colts were, who was really kind of beloved in the Baltimore area, even long after his playing days, opened a series of hamburger chains that became Gino's Hamburgers that was very popular in the mid-Atlantic Baltimore area in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, he is a Baltimore icon, lived a very long life, just passed away 2 years ago. And like I said, he was kind of to the defense what Unitas was to the offense. They didn't count sacks in those days, so it's hard to tell. But yeah, he was my number 1 as well.
I totally agree with you guys because, especially putting him first on the list, he's number 1. He was a man's man, like you said, a guy, war hero, the hero of a great defense in the late 50s and early 60s for the Colts, who were basically the team, next to the Giants for many years in that span. And, and he teamed up with guys like Art Donovan on that great Colts defense of that era. And he was their leader. And I know we had Upton Bell on talking about when he was player personnel during the 60s with the Colts, and Upton had nothing but great things to say about it. I guess Marchetti was just a great man too, besides being a great player and, a great warrior for our country. So no doubt about it. Gino is our man at the top.
And that defensive line was the strength of that team with Donovan and even with Big Daddy Lipscomb, who was a really good All-Pro player for a couple of years in the late 50s. So yeah, totally. One of the greatest defensive linemen of all time.
Yeah, totally agree. And probably one of the greatest defensive fronts of all time, like you were alluding to. So yeah, I think no doubt about him. Do we want to talk about Ditka or Robinson next?
I have Ditka at number 2.
Okay.
It becomes so much with Ditka, sort of the persona overshadows. It often even overshadows what kind of a coach he was. And obviously he was, a coach for some really good Bears teams beyond just 85, but 85 alone is enough. But, you know, I think a lot of times sort of the sweater vest and the clips of him cursing and the, you know, all that sort of overshadows that. Yeah, this is still a phenomenal player in his own right with the Bears and then later with the Cowboys. I know he was briefly with the Eagles in between. First team all NFL 63, 64, second team 62, 65, and 66. So there's a 5-year run where he's either first or second team all pro with those Bears teams, which you know, won that championship in 63. Then he goes to the Cowboys. He's on the early, not the very earliest, but he's on those Cowboy teams that make those couple of Super Bowls there. So I
catches a touchdown pass in the Super Bowl when they beat Miami.
Yep. Yeah. So I went with him there as number 2.
Yeah, and I was kind of torn because Dave Robinson had some really good years. He was not on the earliest 60s Packers teams, the ones that beat the Giants in the NFL title game in 61 and 62. But then he was a key player on the later teams, the teams that won 3 in a row in the first 2 Super Bowls. In fact, I'm pretty sure that in the 66 NFL title game, not the Ice Bowl the year before, when the Cowboys were driving down the field to score what would have been the tying touchdown in that 66 NFL title game. And I believe it was Robinson who got into the backfield and pressured Roger Staubach and forced him to throw the ball away. And then Staubach threw an, I'm sorry, Don Meredith, it was not Staubach, it was Don Meredith, threw an interception. And yeah, and it was Robinson who was in the backfield pressuring Meredith, and then Meredith throws the interception. So kind of one of the heroes of that 66 title game. I was very close between Ditka and Robinson. I ended up also going with Ditka. It was very, very close. And maybe the only reason I did it was because Ditka routinely makes a list of sort of the best, 7 or 8 tight ends of all time, and Robinson doesn't do the same for linebackers. That might be a little bit of a flimsy basis for my decision, but I might call them 2A and 2B if I really had a choice, but I did kind of give Ditka the narrow edge over Dave Robinson.
I was in a similar situation. I took Ditka 2 and Robinson 3, but Robinson, just to be fair to him, think about who he was playing next to on that linebacking core. He had Nitschke on there. Willie Davis was up in front of him on defensive end, but Nitschke was just a beast. He was probably, him and Butkus were probably the best linebackers of that era of the 60s. So Robinson played sort of a second fiddle, but man, he would have been linebacker A on probably any other team except the Bears.
A couple other things I would note about Robinson. It took him a long time to get into the Hall of Fame. He was just inducted, I think, in like 2014. If you give me a second here, I'll look at the final list here. Robinson was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2013. He was part of the class of 2013, so it took him a while. He's also, and Andrew and I can speak to this because when we do our in memoriam episodes, there were a lot of members of those Packer dynasties who passed away last year. Willie Davis, Willie Wood, Herb Adderley, Paul Hornung. Robinson and Jerry Kramer are sort of the last living legends, the last 2 Hall of Famers from those 60s Packers teams. So he's a guy who's been an ambassador for those teams for the last 50 or so years. So yet, without question, a great player, Dave Robinson.
Yeah. And I think the first 3 is pretty clear there. You could maybe rotate Robinson and Ditka like we talked about, but I think it's a pretty, assuming you do what we all seem to have done and struck Mackey off the list just from a number standpoint, hard to argue with those being the top 3 in some order. Yeah,
totally agreed. So I guess that takes us we've talked about the four Hall of Famers that we're going to speak of and put three of them on our list. So now we get into that land of, I like to call them not yet in the Hall of Fame, because I think there may be a couple of these guys we're going to talk about that may be future Hall of Famers here, and probably real soon, probably in the next decade or so, I'm guessing. So where do we want to start with these guys?
My number 4 fit into that category that you just mentioned. Did yours, Andrew?
My number 4 is, I would assume, ought to be a Hall of Famer, pretty soon.
Yeah, so it sounds like we have the same guy.
Steve Smith?
Yep.
Yeah, I went with Steve Smith here. Long career, 13 seasons with the Panthers, 3 more seasons with Baltimore. Was a 2-time first-team All-Pro, 01 and 05, second-team All-Pro in 08, there's a pretty decent spread there. Being an All-Pro in 2001 and then being an All-Pro in 2008 as well. He's also, I believe, 8th all-time in receptions. I had that. I'm going to pull that up just to be sure. And again, it's 8th all-time in receiving yards. And if you look at the guys who are above him, Jerry Rice, Larry Fitzgerald, Terrell Owens, Randy Moss, Isaac Bruce, Tony Gonzalez, Tim Brown, Steve Smith. So that puts him above guys like Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne, Chris Carter. I know it's a much more pass-happy era, but certainly he goes in the rare air in terms of numbers even within that era, and the longevity on top of that.
Yeah, he has 1,000 yards receiving in 2014 with Baltimore at the age of 35. The other thing I think is interesting is in 2004, I guess he was hurt because he only played 1 game, and then he came back in 05 the following year, which was probably his best season. 1,563 yards on 103 receptions, leads the league in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. First team All-Pro, Pro Bowler, wins Comeback Player of the Year. How many guys play another full decade after winning Comeback Player of the Year?
Well, my biggest question is, why did Carolina let him go and have to play for the Baltimore Ravens? Because as a Steelers fan, I have a problem with that. The guy was too good to be on the Ravens. He's a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he had more left, I think, than a lot of people thought. And that's the other thing you kind of got to remember with him too is, he came in 01. I think that was that 1-15 Panthers team, which is the reason that George Seifert's not in the Hall of Fame. And he had some years with Delhomme, but did not play. There was a lot of time guys after Delhomme. I think the Panthers had Vinny Testaverde back for a while. And then, he had Cam Newton. It didn't play his whole career with great quarterbacks like some guys are fortunate to do. Kind of went through the ringer with several different guys. And then who would have been the quarterback on those Ravens teams? Flacco?
Yeah.
Right.
So, Flacco had some nice years, but still not, it's not Patrick Mahomes back there. So to put up those kind of numbers over that era without the benefit of a great offense most of the time, I think is equally as impressive, as is also a guy of his stature having that kind of a career as well. What was he? Was he 5'10", something along those lines?
5'9", 195 pounds.
There you go.
So, I think even one of those seasons with the Ravens was the year that Flacco got hurt early in the season. And I think Ryan Mallett was throwing to him. I think the one season, if I remember correctly.
Maybe that was why he retired.
That could be. It makes me want to retire. But yeah, I totally agree with you guys that him being the 4th player in there. We're too agreeable tonight. We got to shake some things up here. Maybe this is a
as we get later on, there will probably be more because there's a little more variation. I mean, we had 3 Hall of Famers and Steve Smith, who I think we all agree will be a Hall of Famer pretty much, if not the year he's eligible, not too long after that.
I agree. So, okay, where does our next player take us to then?
So I went with number 5, and maybe this is where we're going to get into a little bit of this disagreement. I went with Otis Taylor as my number 5. Wide receiver for the Chiefs from 65 to 75. One of the stars of the 69 Super Bowl winning team, scored a touchdown in that Super Bowl. It's sort of a famous highlight. He kind of does like a sideline route and gets free of the defensive back and then runs 20 to 30 yards down the sideline for the last score for the touchdown in that Super Bowl 4 against Minnesota. Couple of all-pro selections, a couple of 1,000 yards receiving. Not in the Hall of Fame, not a guy who I don't think deserves to or will be in the Hall of Fame, but that was where I went next, was with Otis Taylor.
I had Taylor at 6, although, you certainly may have talked me in to him there. It looks like it says here he was the MVP of the 69 AFL championship game. So that would have he was the MVP of the last AFL game ever played, if you think about it.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. So he, and then it's not like he was a guy who was done shortly after that. He played 6 years in the NFL, was a first team All Pro in 1971 and 72 in the NFL. And then, before that had been a first team All Pro in 66 and 67. So, I had him one slot below, but you can certainly convince me of him being 5. I did have to I had never heard the story of him with Jack Del Rio until doing my research on this.
I still have not heard this story. Have you, Darren?
Please tell us. I'm anxious.
Now I'm a little worried it's flimsily sourced, but I looked into this and it seems pretty legit. So if you guys look this up and it's a wives' tale, feel free to edit it out. But I'm pretty sure this is legit. So Jack Del Rio was on the Chiefs during the strike in 1987. Otis Taylor was a scout or, not like the GM, but he was in some sort of either scouting or front office position with the Chiefs, but kind of an obscure one, not like a player would necessarily know him. The striking players were outside picketing, and there were there were replacement players at the time, and they were out there giving a real hard time to anyone who was there to cross the picket line, basically. And Otis Taylor gets out of his car and I guess had kept in pretty good shape after he retired. Jack Del Rio beat him up. And let's be honest that you shouldn't beat up a replacement player either, but you especially shouldn't be wrong and be beating up one of the best players in the history of the franchise who also happens to work in the front office. So, yes, there is an article here from Silver and Black. Well, this thing I see here is from a Raiders blog on SB Nation, but it seems, sourced from something else. And I guess Otis Taylor ended up suing Del Rio, and they would end up settling out of court. But I couldn't believe I had never heard of this.
I haven't either.
Especially because Jack Del Rio has been an NFL coach for a long time, was a head coach in Jacksonville and then in Oakland. He beat up Otis Taylor.
God, the worst that Shane Falco got in the movie Replacements. So when he was a replacement player, was just his car rolled over. God, getting beat up. That sounds pretty harsh.
And it's funny, when they had the baseball strike in 94, they did have some replacement players that were in their mid 40s, but I guess in the NFL, especially at wide receiver, you probably wouldn't have had that. So good for Otis Taylor for looking like he could have been a replacement player.
Yep. So I read real quick an article I have here from the Los Angeles Times in 1987. So contemporary source. First day of picketing, many of the Chiefs surrounded by picket signs are gathering for an initial demonstration. Up rolls a pickup truck. Tire thing appeared. Later that day, 2 players are picketing, Jack Del Rio and somebody else. A local small college student comes to Arrowhead for a replacement tryout. His agent drives him over. After the tryout, the agent walks out and discovers the tires on his car slashed. Out walks the player, escorted by Otis Taylor. Del Rio doesn't recognize Taylor, screams. They grab each other, roll around on the ground. So, yes.
Wow. No, that's LA Times, so that's pretty legitimate there.
So let's give him credit for aging well enough where 15 years after his career ended, he could be mistaken for a still active NFL player or potential replacement player. So just a little color to the proceedings.
Who did you have at 5, Darren?
I ended up having Wes Chandler ahead of Otis Taylor as the wide receiver, and I had it. I mean, it was close, but I just sort of went with the Pro Bowls. Wes Chandler had 4 Pro Bowls. Taylor had 3. I mean, that's pretty loose. Even though Taylor has more All Pro seasons than Wes Chandler has. But I don't know. I just picked it that way because I thought he had some pretty good numbers for the era he played in. Almost 9,000 yards receiving, 56 touchdowns, and guy was just a stud, especially playing his first 3 or 4 seasons with New Orleans Saints when they weren't very good. I think that was the years they were wearing the bags over their heads. And then, got to play on the San Diego Chargers, and, Dan Fouts and the gang really took him in. But I thought they're probably, about equal. I just put Wes Chandler ahead of Otis Taylor just for those reasons.
And I have to say, I knew nothing about Wes Chandler. The name was maybe vaguely familiar to me. And he, like you said, he started off with the very bad New Orleans Saints, which was that still the Archie Manning years in the late 1970s?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Manning was just maybe going on his demise and getting out of there at that time.
I looked at it. Yeah, he was there at least in, through 79, Manning. And then he goes to the Chargers, Wes Chandler, and plays with this amazing offense, this Air Coryell, Dan Fouts team. And his best year, his only All-Pro year, and I was looking at it, and he led the league in receiving with 1,032 yards. He averaged 129 receiving yards per game, which is just insane if you think about it. And then I'm looking and I'm like, but he only played 8 games. And then I realized that was the strike year. So he put up numbers that would have been pretty good numbers, 9 touchdowns, 1,032 yards. And that's in 8 games in a strike year. That was his highest receiving total, not for his whole career, but he only had a couple of seasons where he put up those type of numbers in a 16 game season. So, I mean, obviously, who knows, maybe he could have been injured at some point or whatever, but if they had played a full season in 1982, he might have had 1,600 yards and, 15 or 16 touchdowns. So it really is a shame. We talk about strikes, that year's strike wrecked such havoc on what would have been a career year, what probably already was a career year for Wes Chandler. And I had him 6th. I'm a little ashamed to say that I didn't know all that much about his career before researching this. So I had Taylor and Chandler flipped. I don't know, Andrew, was Chandler your 5?
I had Chandler immediate. No, I had Chandler. He probably should have been, but I had Chandler right below Taylor. So I had them 6 and 7.
Okay. So we're all kind of sort of on the same page here.
Hey, but I'll go with you guys. You guys trump me. You have the votes to get him. So we'll put Taylor 5, Chandler 6.
But we got to hear who Andrew's 5 was now.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
And like I said, I went with Fred Dreyer here. Ultimately, you guys could probably convince me to go with the order we were just talking about. Dreyer, obviously became kind of a famous, to some degree, Hollywood actor after that. Was a first-team All-Pro in 1974, was credited unofficially with 15 sacks in 1974. Obviously, 82 was when sacks started to become an official stat. Second-team All-Pro in 75. All-NFL rookie with the Giants in 69, was there for 3 years, and then spent 10 years with the Rams, played in that, or was on the team that played in that Super Bowl against the Steelers in 79. Had a relatively short, after the mid 70s, he was around, but wasn't quite the same, level of player. But if you just look at some of the numbers, again, these are all unofficial, but 8.5 sacks in 69, 12 in 70, 8.5 in 71. And those were all with the Giants. And then he moves to the Rams, 8.5. The year I was talking about where he had the 15 sacks he was credited with, was a really good defensive player on some kind of underrated or maybe underappreciated Rams teams, is credited again, all unofficially, with 104 career sacks. So, and he's also the only player in NFL history to have 2 safeties in one game.
And I had Dreyer 7, so I don't know, Darren, where he was for you, but
I had him right in that same range you did, right after Taylor and Chandler. Okay. And I mean, he was a member of that, the fearsome foursome. mean, we talked about great defensive lines earlier. I mean, that's probably one of the most outstanding defensive lines too. I mean, you had, believe it, Rosie Greer, Dreyer, Merlin Olsen, and I'm trying to think who's the other. He had another big star on there, and I'm ashamed I forgot his name.
Well, Youngblood came later.
Right. Youngblood actually ended up playing opposite of Dreyer.
Did you say Deacon Jones?
Deacon Jones. That's it.
Yeah. No, that's the guy. Yeah, that's you know, one of the best best defensive linemen of all time, Deacon Jones.
Right. And you know, they have him down. I had John Turney on for the jersey number 85s, and John Turney is with Pro Football Journal, and he is one of the two gentlemen, him and Nick Webster, that this past summer got those sacks totals from 1960s all the way to 1981 put on Pro Football Reference. And you know, he told, you know, he went on and on in that episode telling us how him and Nick went through all the game books, game film. You know, Chris Willis from NFL Films helps him out, gave him some game films and some places to check out there, and you know, diligently went through these sacks. So I think they're pretty legitimate. They'll probably never be accepted as gospel to the NFL, but I think those 15 sacks are legitimate. I believe what John and Nick are telling us.
All right. So how do we want to, I like Chandler for 5. Do we want to go Chandler, Dreyer, Taylor?
That's fine with me. I mean, I think you could make a case for all of them. It sounds like Chandler is the consensus 5. You know, it's hard to compare the two of them between Dreyer and Taylor, but you know, because they played on opposite sides of the ball. But I could go. Yeah, I don't feel strongly either way about, you know, one of them being over the other one.
Yeah, the only thing that I was a little bit disappointed that Dreyer, according to the whoever decides goes to the Pro Bowl, I don't know who it was at that time. Might have been the coaches, might have been the press, but only giving him making one Pro Bowl. That kind of surprised me for the stature that man was. I remember, you know, the majority of his career. You know, I was young then, but I remember him playing. And that really shocked me that he only had one Pro Bowl, where, you know, Taylor and Chandler each had, you know, multiple Pro Bowls and some All Pros to boot with that.
I'd be fine with bumping Taylor over Dreyer too. I think that'd be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do think I saw something that said Dreyer 1 year was selected but couldn't play because he was hurt. But you know, the point still stands. So yeah, I think that's the order my brother just listed sounds like probably the correct answer. So.
Okay, so we'll go Chandler 5, Taylor 6, Dreyer 7.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. Where do we want to go next here with this?
This is where I slid the homer pick in and put Bavaro at number 8. You know, all pro, only 7 years with the Giants, and then I don't know if he wore number 89 with either Cleveland or Philadelphia. I'd have to look into that, but or 6 years with the Giants. But, you know, for a couple of those years, he was the all-pro tight end. He won 2 Super Bowls, was a very prolific blocker and part of that off. He was very central to that offense, whether it was running towards him or as a primary pass catcher in that offense. It's not like the Giants of that era were throwing the ball 50 yards down the field a whole lot. You know, again, it's hard to – he's a guy who – is probably the third most beloved player on those teams to this day. You know, I'm talking about looking back with hindsight of 30 years. So you try to separate sort of the lore and the mystique, if you will, around Bavaro and some of those plays. But I will also readily admit that there's a little bit of homerism in there for me, but I had to get him in, and this felt like a good spot to sneak him in there. So
I did not have Bavaro 8. I did have Bavaro in my top 10. I, at number 8, went with another tight end. I went with Frank Wycheck. Three Pro Bowls, 98, 99, 2000, and also played a role in the Music City Miracle. So I don't know, maybe that bumped him up ever so slightly, being part of that memorable playoff game against Buffalo in early 2000. So I did have Bavaro. I had Bavaro at number 10, but Wycheck was my number 8.
I had the exact same thing as Dan did. I had Wycheck, then Bavaro right after him.
So I actually had Bavaro 10, not 9, but your point's taken. So, yeah. Did you have Wycheck somewhere on your list, Andrew?
I actually didn't. I had him just sort of as like just outside of it. But he's it. I think I was when I was looking at the list, I was expecting to put him on the list and then just wasn't quite as impressed as I expected to be. But I mean, again, you're talking, it's not like you guys had him at number 2 when I didn't have him on the list at all. If it was a top 12 or a top 13, I definitely would have had him. Certainly one of the, in the late 90s, it looks like was a 3-time Pro Bowler in that era. So, and like you said, was involved in one of the most famous plays of all time. I believe he actually should be credited with a completed pass. So, I mean, I could definitely see Wycheck being there, and did play a lot longer than Bavaro. Now I don't know how many years I don't know if he wore the uniform the whole time. He had 9 years in number 89 to Bavaro's
6.
So,
he had 11 years total, but he had 4 different jersey numbers he wore. I'm sorry, 3 different jersey numbers he wore.
Yeah. Maybe with Washington, he had a couple of different numbers, and then
right.
Houston, Tennessee, the Oilers, then the Titans, et cetera, et cetera. But, I could certainly see putting Wycheck on there, and I could see putting him above Bavaro if that's the consensus.
Darren, you said you wanted disagreement. I think we've got some here because by my calculation, you and I each have 1 more to name, and Andrew has 2.
I do.
I find that interesting too. I'm anxious to hear this.
Should I go with one of my next guys here?
Sure.
All right. So I went a little maybe off the board. I don't know. I went with a guy by the name of Bob D, who, again, I have to admit, I did not know much about. And I sort of, again, look at a guy who played most of his career in the AFL, and I give it a slight minus, not a ton, but slight. But a couple of years with Washington, 57, 58, and then played 8 years with the Boston Patriots. 4-time All-Star in the AFL, so their equivalent of a Pro Bowl, 61, 63, 64, 65. Second team All-AFL. His number is retired from the Patriots, which, again, I factor in a little bit with these things. Played in 134 games. Apparently left Washington for a year to go back and coach the offensive line at Holy Cross, which is a little bit weird. So I went with him here. He had 33 sacks, recorded officially 33 sacks, not including his strip sack of Tommy O'Connell in the AFL's first exhibition game. This likes to point out here. 2 interceptions in the Patriots Eastern Division Championship game against the Bills. So just a pretty long, lengthy, solid career in the AFL. Obviously, it was the AFL, and it was in the pre-Super Bowl era for the most part, so probably not a ton of people would, know about him. But he also, if you look at a picture of this guy, he has the 50s football player look.
Yeah.
That's not that I'm counting that, but he's got the haircut and the jaw and the.
And I would also note that 63 Patriots team that made it, I think they lost the AFL championship game to the Chargers. Now they lost it very horribly with a record of 51-10, or a score, I should say, of 51-10. Prior to Parcells, you got not a lot of bright seasons for the Patriots franchise. They got that one Super Bowl in 85, which incidentally, just to go on a little bit of a digression here, the Patriots between their founding in 1960 and the Super Bowl they make with Parcells in 96, they make 2 championship games. They make an AFL championship game in 63, and they make the Super Bowl in 85. They lose those 2 games by a combined 41-36, a combined 77 points. So you understand why it was so depressing to be a Patriots fan for all those years. So I actually also had...
They'll all still tell you about it at length as if the last 20 years haven't happened. You gotta understand how bad they were from 1988 to 1993. Oh, all right. Great. Go ahead. Sorry.
I hate to be a Patriots sympathizer. and you guys are forcing me into this week, but I'm a Steelers fan. I went, we were 4 decades before we had a winning season. So
yeah, and we've talked about that in one of our, I forget whether it was some of our early football episodes. It's like, I've brought that up, that it's hard to, a lot of franchises that were bad for a while, like we always talk about as Giants fans, how bad the Giants were from 1963 until the early 80s, and how much suffering, quote unquote, the fans had to go through. There were still eras, in the 50s and the 30s where they were good, and a lot of franchises have that, the Lions, the Cardinals, whatever. The Steelers, until they started getting good in the early 70s, they were like the laughing stock of the league, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, most of the 60s. I mean, again, you would take those 40 years for the next 40 years or 50 years at this point. But yeah, it's funny that there was no bright era before the early 70s.
When you look at video clips of the Steelers from like the 60s, when they played the Lombardi Packers, they got these different uniforms and they got like the yellow on the shoulders. Darren, you must know what I'm talking about. And you look at this team and you're like, who the heck are these guys? Like, it looks like a team that's not in existence anymore, because you figure, I don't know when they changed their uniforms. So, sometime in the early 70s or something. It's been the same uniform, with essentially the same team, with playing in only 2 arenas, with only 3 coaches. And it's like, you forget, like Andrew said, you forget that there were decades of ineptitude before. So yeah, no, there can be this sort of turnaround. I also should mention that when I was a kid and the Patriots were considered one of the, the laughing stock of the NFL and of sports, in the dictionaries that we would use in my elementary school, I think it was the word dejected. And the picture in the dictionary of the word dejected was a Patriots player. I think it was Tony Eason in that 85 Super Bowl with his head in his hands. And it literally was the dictionary definition of the word dejected, was a Patriot player with his helmet in his hands. So all of that is a long-winded way of me saying that I also picked Bob D. He was my last guy. He was my number 9. And he kind of, I don't know, the more we talk about this, the more I'm not feeling great about my Bavaro pick, but I don't know. I've now given my list, and you all each have one more. So I'll be curious to hear what you guys have.
Well, I'll tell you my number 10. It's weak. You guys have a much stronger case for D. I did not have D. I took somebody that I felt was a significant player, even though they don't have the hardware and to show for it in their career stats and everything. But I picked Santana Moss, and I think he was just that A player when he played with the Jets, when he played with the Redskins. He was that guy that you had to worry about on offense. He was a difference maker, and he changed the way defenses played against him for, over a decade. And that's why I chose him, but it's very weak. Bob D's defense that you guys have is much stronger, and I think you guys have swayed me.
Well, Andrew still has one more over Wycheck, so I'm curious to hear that too.
Yeah, and I'm not thrilled with this. The guy I had listed here I had Nat Moore, the receiver. He spent a lot of years with the Dolphins, 74 to 86. He was only a one-time Pro Bowler. He's also kind of famous because he was the guy you see in the clip with what they call the helicopter catch. He's that guy who spins around in the air. Retired with basically every Dolphins receiving record, although they were pretty quickly broken by Mark Duper. But again, hard for me to argue him over Wycheck, but that was the guy I had initially. He had over 500 catches, 74 touchdowns in his career. Also returned punts and kickoffs. And was on some good teams. Obviously played in came to the Dolphins just after the back-to-back Super Bowls, but would have been on the team in 84 and 82, actually, come to think of it, that went to those 2 Super Bowls and lost them to Washington and San Francisco, respectively. But, again, won't fight too hard on him in favor, if you guys want to go with Wycheck or somebody along those lines.
And Darren, you had Bavaro too, you said?
Yeah, I had Bavaro on my list.
Okay,
I was very similar to you, except for at the end, you had D and I had Moss. But,
and we had Wycheck and Andrew didn't.
Correct.
So a compromise between you guys would be Wycheck and D, and that would mean that all 10 of mine made it on. So I don't know. Maybe that's
Live with that.
I think those are the most compelling cases. I think those two. I mean, if we're arguing between Wycheck and D with who else do we have against them? Moss and Moore. I think Wycheck and D have it hands down.
Can I mention a couple other guys that I just kind of had on there? And these are all sort of more recent or relatively recent guys.
Sure.
I had mentioned possibly Amari Cooper. Now and what's funny because I had forgotten exactly which numbers we had done with you before, and I'm looking at this and I'm like, I feel like I've had this conversation before. And then I remember that Andrew and I did 19 also, and we had the Amari Cooper conversation on the other end of it. And I think we kept him off of 19. Maybe we didn't. I'd have to go back and listen because he hadn't worn 19 his whole career. And now come to find out that he didn't wear 89 his whole career either, but he did have a couple good years at the beginning of 89 with Oakland, and he made the Pro Bowl in his first couple of years. So since just like with 19, he didn't wear it his whole career, we probably can't keep him on, but I think the fact that he wore it for a couple of seasons was worth mentioning. I had Mark Chmura, the tight end for the Packers during the Favre years for a couple of years, the Super Bowl teams. And then the other guy I had was Doug Baldwin, who was on the Seattle team with Russell Wilson and, won the Super Bowl 5-6 years ago. So those were my sort of honorable mention guys.
Mm-hmm.
I had one of those too that we haven't talked about that I almost put on the list. That's Billy Joe Dupree, who was a great tight end of the Cowboys in the 1970s, early 80s. This guy had 3 Pro Bowls, of course, a Super Bowl championship with the Cowboys. But he wore the jersey for basically 11 years with the Cowboys, and was the go-to guy when Staubach would get in trouble, or Danny White when he was quarterbacking. So I didn't put him on the list. I'm a little bit ashamed of that, especially picking Santana Moss over him, but but he's significant. Andrew, did you have any that you wanted to add?
No, I think we covered a lot of the guys that I had, and then some of the more recent guys that I had just sort of made note of on my list here. So I think we've kind of exhausted the guys that are on the list, the guys that are close, and then the guys who maybe down the line would be on it, depending on how the rest of their careers develop.
I totally agree. So that was a great discussion here, guys. I appreciate that. That's a lot of insight that you guys bring into this, and especially the stories. That Del Rio story, that's gonna make me have to go to newspapers.com and check that out myself. That's a good one.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would love to know what the financial terms were, but I'm guessing those were not disclosed and will never be disclosed. So
probably not. But I'm sure that he probably was driving a sports car after that Del Rio paid for or something. I'm sure. Probably a good story there too. So, why don't you tell us about what we got coming up in the next few episodes of the Hello Sports podcast?
Sure. We're doing. We actually we're recording just tonight. We were recording before we started with you, and we're going to finish it up after this. Where we did an all-time Giants team, New York Football Giants. Starting 11 for offense and defense, and then kicker, punter, returner, that type of thing. Where we don't entirely follow the seasons, but we start to try and follow them a little bit. So we're going to be doing a little more football as the fall rolls around. The next episode to post will probably be one about Philadelphia sports in 1980 and 1981, when between June of 80 and January of 81, all 4 teams in Philly made the championship game of their respective sports. So we've got that coming. We've got an episode on the 1959 Go-Go Chicago White Sox that made the World Series. That was a listener request. And some other things. I think we're going to do the 20th we're going to do an episode on 1986 in sports for the 35th anniversary of that. There's a lot of interesting things that happened in sports in 1986. We think we're going to do one on the 1996 Yankees, which holds a special place in both Andrew's and my heart. What else? We have one sort of bigger thing that we want to talk about, but Andrew had a cool idea of this random year thing that we're going to do. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and we may have even talked about this the last time we were on here. I like to come up with a bunch of ideas, and then, we still have a bunch in the can and a bunch to record. So it's kind of a while before an idea comes to fruition, but sort of an ongoing series. I was thinking that we can start as I think when you came on, when you joined the call, we were in the middle of recording another podcast we were expecting to be done with, and we always go long. And I kind of thought, as a challenge, I'm going to guess we can get a podcast out of almost any team. So as a challenge, I thought we could pick a year sort of randomly from the 20th century, and then pick a team randomly from the 20th century, and then do an episode on them. So it would be kind of funny if the first one we do is a team that enrages me, like a team that from my childhood beat a team I like, or that I had players I didn't like. But more likely than not, we're going to end up with a team that's not a distinguished team. We might end up with the 1977 Houston Rockets, who I don't know what they did, but let's say they went 500. But I'm guessing with the guys on the team, things that maybe happened in the years before, the years after, we can get 50 minutes to an hour out of an episode where we just pick a random team and talk about them. I don't know that we want to go to that well too often, but it's always nice to have that in sort of our back pocket as an ongoing theme of just and maybe we'll learn some cool stuff. Similar to how I never would have learned this Otis Taylor, Jack Del Rio thing if we weren't doing the 89s today. I'm thinking we're going to uncover some gems there.
I think you guys are all over it. I think that sounds very interesting, and it's going to, educate, myself included, the listeners that listen to the whole sports on, maybe some teams we're not that familiar with. I like you say the 77 Rockets, I probably couldn't even tell you any players were on those team, but I'm sure there's probably some NBA stars that were, either at the end of their career, beginning of their career, or, that we didn't even recognize were Rockets then. So,
and we're going to limit it to basketball, baseball, and football, because neither of us are hockey guys enough to.
All the people that listen to cricket just turned off the podcast. So.
Yeah, if we ended up with the 1984 St. Louis Blues, I think that would be we would have the Blues. I think if that was what we chose.
Yeah. So, but we'll see how it goes the first time or two, and it, like I said, it's nice to come up with sort of recurring ideas we can go back to if the wells really running dry at any point.
And then the other
go ahead.
No, and then the other thing I would mention, and this is in the very preliminary stages, and shout out to Arnie Chapman, who runs this whole thing, this whole network, because he just emailed us this morning. But the former manager of a number of teams, most notably the Mets in the late 90s and early 2000s, Bobby Valentine, who took them to a World Series, well-known guy. He's been on ESPN, and he's, managed some different teams, and, a well-known guy, Bobby Valentine, somebody who actually was in the news a lot over the last couple of weeks because with the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the role that the Mets in the city played in that. He is coming out with a new book, an autobiography that he's written with somebody. And Arnie was contacted by his publicist, asking if somebody on the Sports History Network wanted to do an interview with him. And, we doing sort of probably of all the shows, we probably do the most baseball of any show. Maybe there's one or two others. I don't want to slight anybody, but so that's, there's the possibility that Andrew and I at some point over the next couple months will be doing an interview with Bobby Valentine, which would just be, incredible. Cool. Because, that would be awesome. I hope that works out for you. So do we. And we certainly thought we'd get some authors and stuff when we did this, but nobody on the level of a Bobby Valentine. So that would be, that'd be pretty cool. When we were joking, we grew up listening to him go back and forth and, getting big arguments with the the sports talk hosts on Sports Talk Radio and WFAN in New York, and we listened to as teenagers. So it'd be cool to kind of be in that role, although we certainly wouldn't aim to make it contentious. But so that's, again, a lot of moving parts probably still have to come through for that to happen. But hopefully that's something to look forward to, maybe coinciding with the release of his book in early November.
Well, I wish you guys luck. I hope that comes to fruition for you, because that sounds like a really awesome opportunity for you guys to get to talk, especially somebody that you guys followed from the New York area that was such an integral part at some very big times in the city and help them heal. So
exactly,
it'd be incredible. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time, guys, because I know I interrupted your segment that you were recording, and I know you got more to record, and I don't want your voices to be too dry to finish that episode because I'm one of your listeners. So I want to make sure you guys are tip top, fresh shape. So I appreciate your time and your knowledge, guys.
And this is always a pleasure, Darren. And I just want to say real quick, obviously, you do many episodes a week, so haven't listened to every single number, but I listened to you with George Bazika, who you and I both had the pleasure of meeting at the PFRA convention a couple months ago, and listened to you and him do 76 a couple weeks ago. And I think I emailed you to let you know this, but I really enjoyed that. And George, as a lifelong Canton resident, really brings a really cool perspective. So to put in a plug for a specific episode, if you haven't listened to one, I really enjoyed Darren and George doing 76 a couple weeks ago. So that was a really good one.
Oh, well, thank you. And I hope I'm not spoiling anything, but there is a good chance that George maybe, and his son, John, who is a radio personality in the Canton area, may be joining our network with a show of their own. So that's in the works, hopefully, that'll come to fruition too. So to hear more of George. Hopefully we get Bobby and the network gets George, and we just continue to grow. So that sounds great. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, guys. That was a great list we put together, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Darren.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings you sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items. Plus, get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes. That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our broadcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings you sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique unique items with a retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long-sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row 1 catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row 1 Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.